it's our pleasure at Machon Shilo to again have Dr. Jeremy England with us, a renowned physicist, former professor of physics at M.I.T, author of the book Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel, and Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, the head of Machon Shilo, will introduce Dr. England.
Shalom, and welcome to all and sundry. I am very pleased that I am able to participate this week. I had hoped to do the same last week, but that was somehow not possible. But I did hear a recording of the first Shiur by Dr. England, and it was fascinating, as I was quite certain it would be. The interface between science and Torah is a cardinal question in our times. It has really been a central issue from time immemorial almost, but certainly nowadays this is a very, very crucial question that must be addressed, and it can only really be addressed by people who are familiar with science, the scientific method, and even more precisely, the philosophy of science. And thus, we were privileged to hear last week a very interesting shiur which touched upon these questions last week, and I look forward to today's shiur from Dr. England. And without further ado, the microphone is yours, Dr. England.
Thank you very much for that, Rav, and thank you all for being here today, as it was last week and as it is today, and may it begin B'ezrat Hashem. It's a great honor to be able to address this audience. I guess this might be the time to start sharing the sources if possible. Today, what I wanted to talk about is, in one sense, in my mind, connected with the shiur that we began with last week, since it tries to pose the question of how we should be trying to relate to the data of experience, as a scientist might put it, but as Ovdei Hashem, as servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how are we supposed to be positioned in our interpretation of events in history, events in our lives, etc., if we're taking the guidance that seems to be there in the Torah to help us find our way. And there are elements of this argument which do connect with some of what we discussed last time, where we were specifically talking about looking at the past. But I think a different angle on the same discussion, because there you have to approach this question from many different directions to give it a thorough treatment, is more about, let's say, how a Navi, or for that matter, how a member of Am Yisrael, how a prophet, or how a member of the Israelite nation is supposed to know that they're receiving some kind of authentic message from the creator of the world himself, as opposed to some other kind of message that they might receive from some other source, be it human or otherwise, some other power that impresses them, which might not actually be what we would view as authentic, meaning it's not coming to us with the signature of Borei Olam, of the creator of the world. And what does it mean to compare possibilities there? How is one supposed to make that decision? And that's kind of an abstract way of starting out. More concretely, this is about the narrative scenario we're given by the Torah, the idea of Am Yisrael standing at Har Sinai, right? They are receiving the Torah in this singular moment of revelation, as described, for example, in Parshat Yitro, the experience of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. And we are so familiar with this narrative construct that we tend to just accept that it was a very impressive experience, and those who experienced it were correct to presume that the teaching, the Torah that they were being given, was indeed penned, so to speak, by the hands of Melech Malchei HaMelachim, the king of all the world, the judge of all the world. But we don't often, I think, step back to ask, how did they actually know that was true? And a related question, because this is not just a sort of academic curiosity to raise this point, looking backwards and imagining ourselves to be in the position of Bnei Yisrael a very long time ago. It's more generally a question for us today. How are we to relate to the Torah on the one hand, and what we observe and and discover about the world on the other hand, and take those things together and come to some greater sense of confidence that there is coherence between these pictures, and how might it be the case that experience in the world in the present, whether at a personal level or at a national level, can undergird or support one's decision to view the world through the lens that the Torah provides us with. So that's the overarching question, and I think it'll be a little easier to pose more explicitly what we might mean by getting into some sources. And as we'll see, it ends up being substantively a return to some of the topics that we touched on last time, but maybe looking at them from a slightly different angle. So the first source is a very familiar one. It's this moment when Moshe Rabbeinu is drawn to gaze upon the sneh, what we call often in English the burning bush. Hasneh bo'er ba'esh ve'asneh einin ukal. The Torah tells us that in this moment when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is manifesting himself some way to Moshe in Har Chorev, which we also call Har Sinai, this mountain in the desert when Moshe is herding a flock of sheep, that the bush or the shrub, whatever a sneh is, how we want to translate that, it is burning and on fire, but it is not consumed. And the operative point that the text draws our attention to is that this caught Moshe's attention, presumably because something seemed anomalous to him, right? That fire is supposed to consume that which it enwreathes and surrounds, but in this case, this living thing was not being consumed, or at least this once living material that can be fuel for a fire was not being consumed. So it says, "Vayomer Moshe, asur lana ve'ev'eh et hamar'eh hagadol hazeh madua lo yiv'ar hasneh." So he is turning to pay attention because there is a puzzle presented by his experience and observation, which is a disagreement between different expectations of a more sort of normal behavior for a phenomenon in question. That when you have fires burning shrubs, they should either be, or they're expected to be consumed, or if you have shrubs that are not being consumed, you expect them to not be on fire. So that already calls our attention to the role of seemingly unnatural anomaly as an element in this story, right? That the first moment of what we would call prophetic revelation, full blown, as it's ultimately going to redound to the whole future evolution of Am Yisrael into a nation that keeps the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In that moment, it's not a telegram, it's not a letter written on a page. It is a seemingly unnatural event that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses to begin this message with, and we have to ask ourselves why. So I think we'll try to dig into that question in due course. We can go down now to source 2. And in a sense, I'm skipping ahead narratively now because there's this dialogue that ensues between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Moshe Rabbeinu. And ultimately, Moshe is posing this question of how he is supposed to convince Bnei Yisrael that he is having the true and authentic experience of receiving revelation from the hand of Borei Olam, of the creator of the world. And this is posed at the moment as though it is more kind of a narrative necessity that he's going to go and tell them a story and he needs them to believe it because he's going to go down to Mitzrayim and try to convince them to follow him out. But this really is, in another sense, a treatment of the more general question. He's already standing on Sinai, right? He's standing in the place where the full revelation of the Torah is going to take place. He's on Har Chorev, which we also call Har Sinai. The Torah in various passages conflates these two. Or in any case, he is on a mountain of God, Har HaElohim, as it's described in the Torah, and that evokes the idea of a mountainous encounter with the Creator, and so even at the very least, it evokes Sinai, and you could also more directly argue it's the same place. So he's going to bring them to a mountain for revelation, and this is the same question you can ask that we often don't, of why is it that Bnei Israel, even if they had them there, right? We're not. So we're going to also talk about ourselves, because I've never, in a very, let's say, journalistic sense, been standing at a mountain in a desert that was on fire and hearing loud crashes and the sound of the shofar, etc. So we also have to ask, how is it that Bnei Israel of all generations are supposed to participate in this experience? But before getting to that, there's a more basic question. For a person who we think of as being most materially and simply there and present in this moment, why is it okay for them to be convinced? Why should they not have remained skeptical about what they were witnessing? So what do I mean by that? Well, what we actually have described to us, and we'll get into the specific sources further down, are very impressive things like a mountain on fire and big loud crashes, the sound of the shofar, there's smoke, there's darkness. It's very hard to orchestrate this. And you would imagine, therefore, in one sense, that only a tremendous power could have orchestrated such an event. And yet at the same time, given the finiteness of the human beings who are witnessing this, you might also think it possible that a human being could be impressed by something they should not have found sufficiently impressive, right? That a finite power could overwhelm their skepticism by doing something quite dazzling. So what is the difference between the true creator of the world taking these people into the desert and showing them things that very much awe and impress them, versus some charlatan, finite powered, showing them many of the same things that are very impressive, but really, in fact, being unable to do all the things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could do, but just able to do enough to overwhelm people's sense of skepticism. Now, that's a significant point that the Torah makes itself, funnily enough. So you would think that this is a question of someone who's showing reluctance to put their faith in what the Torah is telling them. However, the Torah itself takes up this very topic, because in this moment where Moshe says, what if the people will not listen to me? Vayan Moshe, vayomer, vehen lo yaminu li, velo yishma'u b'koli, ki yomeru lo nir'a elecha Adonai. Right? He said, the people will say, the Lord didn't appear to you. So what am I supposed to show them? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him otot, he gives him signs, and he gives them 3 signs, but we'll start with the first one, which is perhaps the most famous, or at least one of the 2 more famous. Vayomer elav Adonai, ma ze biyadecha, vayomer mateh. Vayomer hashlicheo arza, vayishlicheo arza, vayi lenachash, vayanos Moshe mepanav. So he has a staff, he throws it on the ground, it becomes a nachash, it becomes a serpent, and then also when he grabs it by the tail, it becomes a mateh, a staff in his hand again. Very impressive, right? And seemingly miraculous. And I will note this word vayanos or vayanas is one that we heard before in the last Shiur, mentioning in a sidelong way this moment with Yosef Tzaddik, with Eshet Potiphar. There's a whole thing that we might eventually in another Shiur make out of this word. I don't think it's accidental that Chazal taught us that the word Nes is spelled Nun Samech. I understand that the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, don't use that word to mean a miracle, but I think Chazal derive it from instances of words like this, associated with events like this. This is the prototypical miraculous event, or archetypal, let's say, miraculous event. A stick turning into a snake, very impressive. Then we go to Mitzrayim, and in Mitzrayim, it is not Moshe who's turning a mateh admittedly, into a nachash, a staff into a serpent. It is Aaron turning a M.I.T into a tanin, which presumably is some other kind of reptile, maybe a serpent, maybe some other kind of reptile. Still very similar, right? And the relevant point here is that Paro has sorcerers who are his, pagan charlatans who do his bidding, and they come in and they duplicate the trick, seemingly, or at least they do something that's sufficiently impressive. They cast on their rods, and their rods turn into the similar tanin reptile that we got from Aharon. And so the Torah is showing us, in a sense, if you think that the point of this oath that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to Moshe is that it's a really, for lack of a better word, cool magic trick, right? And you think that as long as Moshe does sufficiently interesting, dazzling magic tricks, that's what means that he comes with a true message from the creator of the world, there's a problem with that. And the problem is that entirely has to do with your threshold of what it takes to impress you, right? So if you're the sort of everyday folk in Mitzrayim, then maybe you're impressed by making lice, which happens in the third plague, for example. But the magicians of Mitzrayim, they can make the blood in the frogs, and so you say, oh, I'm maybe less impressed by that. But in any case, the whole question of what an individual finds dazzling or marvelous, or what an individual finds overwhelming to their sense of what is possible, that's quite subjective, and that can vary from individual to individual. It can vary from nation to nation. And so we must be, in some sense, according to the Torah, it seems, missing the point if we think that Moshe was given this oath just in order to do something tricky and dazzling. Now, that may have been part of the point, because dazzling gets you some of the crowd, and maybe that is just a function of the oath. There are some people who are convinced easily, and you want them too. But there should be people who are not convinced easily, and this oath was still given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe for the sake of those people. And that means it's trying to teach us something else. It's trying to show us something that is not contained in the magic trick itself. Because Moshe fundamentally is not just the most powerful sorcerer who ever lived, chas v'chalila, right? If we understand his role and his impact in those terms, then we are no better than the pagans that he was trying to liberate Am Yisrael from. There is something else about what he's bringing, his message from Hashem, that has to, in a self-evident way, justify itself and connect itself to the fundamental thesis, which is that the creator of the world, the king and judge of the world, is the one who is claiming the special status of Am Yisrael, and that they have a special relationship, that they're an Am Kadosh and a Mamlechet Kohanim, and that they are called to serve him. So how do we start to unpack this? Well, I think that one point that we have to take note of here is the shift from the Nachash to the Tanin, right? Many things are similar here in these two events, but they're not identical. So why would it be a Tanin in the case where the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, the Chartumim, are matching the trick, but it's a Nachash in the case of the authentic oath that's being given to Moshe and Har Sinai, or Har Horeb, let's say. So you can make different things out of this. I think one thing that must be made out of it is that in the Torah's own terms, the Nachash is a nearly unique or unique animal, unlike a Tanin. And a Tanin is not part of the narrative of Gan Eden in the way that the Nachash is, right? We know the Nachash, specifically that word, from this encounter between Adam and Chava on the one hand, or really, let's say Chava on the one hand, and then the Nachash, the serpent, on the other. So what's the relevant point there? It's that it's the animal that speaks. It's the animal that has a voice. So that's one point. It's also, by the way, an animal that in that narrative context contains the notion of temptation into sin. It also is a shoresh, a root of three letters, nun, chet, shin, which also evokes the idea of nichush, which is pagan augury, the attempt of reading or predicting the world according to signs. That is a forbidden form of pagan magic or sorcery or idolatry. So there's a lot of different elements that are carried in that word that are not carried in the Tanin that appears later on. And I think that's where we want to plant roots and try to dig a little bit deeper if we can. So here's a point that I want to make out of this source that I think will carry through the rest of what we're talking about today, and it may ultimately carry over into a second shiur, because I think I probably am aiming to talk about a subject that needs more than one of these sessions. The Nachash, as a miraculous event, as a trick, if we think of it in those terms, has to be understood as being carefully chosen to be open to the idea that this is really more about a shift in interpretive frame than it is about a physical resubstantiation of the same object, whatever that could mean. Because it could have been, from the standpoint of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whose power is limitless, he's the creator of the world, and everything that happens is the expression of his will. It could have been an elephant, right? It didn't have to be a nachash. And it could have been anything. And in a way, it's much more miraculous to turn it into something that doesn't at all resemble a staff. But the nachash, the serpent, is the animal that most resembles a staff. So on the one hand, it would be impressive to take a stick of wood and turn it into a living creature. On the other hand, it is a living creature that has so much resemblance to the original thing that it is quantitatively less impressive than some other miraculous occurrence that we could have gotten, so to speak, for free from the might of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that moment. So why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu hold some cards close to his chest, or why would he withhold some of that might, in a sense? What is the point of that? I think part of the point has to at least be, or at least part of the point has to be, that we are to think of this as not being about a change of one object into another, but rather of the possibility of discovering a new perspective on the same thing. That you can look at the same thing, and you can, on the one hand, see it as a M.I.T. What is a M.I.T? It is a inanimate object. It is a very predictable object. It's a metrical object, an object you might actually use to measure things. It's an object that has the property that if you hold one end of it and push on it in the right way, that the other end of it predictably does exactly what it is that you intended to. It's a kli, it's an implement in your hand. So it is part and parcel to the conception of the world as a collection of inanimate materials being manipulated by external forces acting on them, right? And I would call that a very physical or material view of what the world is and how it's constituted. On the other hand, what is a nachash? A nachash is a serpent. It's a living creature. It is a whole that has an agency and a vitality, an unpredictability, an ability to seem to make decisions. It also contains the element of surprise. You know, serpents, you think of them as you tread on them where you don't see them, and they can really change the course of events in an unexpected way. And for that reason, perhaps Moshe recoiled when he saw one. So this one object, let's say, we have the opportunity to view in these two different ways. And I'll add back again that the nachash also is the animal that talks. So it's also about not just agency, but the possibility of dialogue, right? That you could look at one world and you could view that world as being constituted, on the one hand, of a bunch of inanimate kelim, a bunch of matot, a bunch of sticks to be used to measure or to be manipulated predictably with no agency of their own. And maybe that is more how the world looks through the eyes of a physicist. But on the other hand, you could look at the same world, the same phenomena, the same data, the same set of events, the same observations, and you could instead find in that collection of observations and events agency, a voice, the possibility of conversation, the possibility of sin, perhaps, because the nachash also connotes that. There's a whole different dimension, both of moral and just semantic meaning, that the nachash carries in. And it also carries the idea, I would say, of looking at the whole as more than the sum of its parts. So you have to kind of bring the different features of observations together. So why is that important? I think the reason that's important is because it will provide for us an explanation for why miraculous occurrence is somehow an important part of the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to relate to us. So this is something we'd be coming at from another direction if we had started with the story of Yosef, and we can do that at some point as well. But looking at Moshe, I think that it's important to emphasize about Moshe that he is the extreme of a spectrum of different kinds of personalities we see in the Torah in terms of how much about the natural fabric of the world around him seems to be constantly unraveling or misbehaving, right? He is the person who gives us Kriyat Yam Suf, the splitting of the sea, all the makot, all the miraculously timed and positioned plagues in Mitzrayim, striking water from a rock, taking people with no sufficient supply of food or water into a desert and somehow allowing them to survive because they are miraculously given food to eat and water to drink. He is all about the nes, all about the miraculous occurrence. And the question is, why was that necessary? Why do we need a deliverer of the sort that Moshe becomes to have all of that associated with him? Why could it not be the case that we tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim in a way that tries to emphasize the naturalism of everything that occurred? Could it be possible to give such an account? Or is that impossible? And if so, is that for a very particular reason? Because clearly HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't forced. His hand is not forced by other constraints. This is the story as he chooses to write it. And when I say story, I mean the story of the events of the world. The whole world is to be understood as, in a sense, a parchment he's writing on. And so if he wants the world to seem perfectly natural all the time, that should not be difficult for him. But he chooses to inject unpredictability and miraculousness into the world as he creates it. And the question is what purpose that serves. What is the reason for that? Why do we need it? What function does it have? I believe in the association with the transformation of the Mateh to the Nachash, and also this word vayanos or vayanas, which we would, if we had more time, link more carefully to the whole idea of nes or miracle, this nun samech. I think what we have to see there is an opportunity to understand what it means to communicate and how that communication must be connected with unpredictability. So let's say I want to send you a message. And let's say that the message that I send you is already known to you, 100%. Nothing that I say is in any way new to you. I start, tapping on my Morse code sending device, my telegraph or what have you, and every single dot and dash was already, so to speak, written down for you. I'm not really communicating in that case. The totally predictable signal that you're receiving is not really an act of communication because it contains no new information. It doesn't convey anything from one place to another or from one party to another. Now let's go to the other extreme, where you have some channel where you're receiving a message and it's completely unpredictable. It is essentially never the case that one thing that you hear was easier to anticipate because of something else you already heard. We call that noise, right? That's just completely uninterpretable garbage. It doesn't bear a message because to bear a message, you also have to have a certain amount of predictability. You have to have syntax and grammar and semantics and all these things, because if I'm speaking a language that you understand about things that make sense to you, then you should often be able to guess the last word in what I say, right? So it wasn't 100% certain that I'd say the word say, but I probably was going to say something along those lines, and you could guess that from the rest of the sentence. So if you're going to communicate, you actually need to be on this balance point between complete predictability on the one hand and complete unpredictability on the other hand. And that is, I believe, one of the things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is building very carefully into this oath that he gives to Moshe. That what he's saying is, you, if you're, let's say, the more skeptical type, and you're not the sort of person who sees a magic trick and says, okay, I'll follow you, then what you're actually looking for is a way to understand that the message that you're getting is really coming from Borei Olam. It's really a communication that was sent to you by the hand of the creator of the world. How are you supposed to see that? It needs to be, in some sense, in the fabric of unpredictability that you view in the created world as it unfolds, layered on top of the backdrop of the predictability of that world. It needs to be the case both that the world has a natural framework in which you can view it, so that produces expectations and the notion of what's likely. so that sometimes something unlikely can happen. And when those unlikely occurrences can happen, they end up starting to be part of forming the basis of a message. Now, that doesn't tell you how to interpret the message, or it doesn't tell you exactly the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tries to, let's say, show us things or give us authentication of what he's trying to say to us on top of what is provided to us in the Torah. But it at least hints at the idea that the Torah is the certainty, the bedrock of, let's say, the interpretive frame or the guide, so to speak, that we're being given for how to understand the data of experience. But we also have the data of experience themselves. We have our lives and we have our nation's history. And those are also things too that we can cogitate about and react to. And if we're looking for unassailable evidence that the creator of the world is signing a message to us, so to speak, then we should be looking for it in the combination of predictability and what we observe about the world, and crucially, unpredictability. Because in these moments of unpredictability, for an Oved Hashem like Moshe Rabbeinu, who has the right kavanah, who receives that unpredictability with the right attitude, there is the possibility of, so to speak, seeing an unmistakable signature of the king and judge of the world in what you observe. That's the thesis that I want to try to build up a more, let's say, pragmatic frame for in the rest of this discussion. But we may not get through all of what can be said about this today, which is exciting because it means there's more time for conversation. I apologize, but because of the device that I'm using, I don't actually see what time it is right now. So I'm just going to ask for a time check. Or I guess I can just do it myself.
Yeah, it's 7:41.
Okay, so I think we will want to shift into having a bit of a discussion before too long, but I'll try to go for maybe another 9 minutes or so, and then we can do the shift. So moving down to the next source. One of the things I think we want to connect this to now, if we're starting to try to get practical and say, okay, that sounds abstractly perhaps plausible. And ideally, I said something that sounds halfway plausible, but it doesn't necessarily seem obvious what one is then supposed to do, or how one is supposed to start, let's say, interpreting the evidence of experience in this way. One of the models for how one can do that interpretation, I think, is provided in a source that we looked at in the last Shiur, which is this moment between Tamar and Yehuda. Because this was presented in the last Shiur as a contrast with, let's say, the forensic way of relating to the data of experience, where you assume there's a natural order and that everything is always happening with this sort of likelihood or determinism set by that natural order. And then you try to reconstruct a model of past events based on the data in the present. But in the model of Tamar and Yehuda, what instead you have is a set of signs that are more like a password, so that there can be an authentication of a message, and it has to do with an agreement from beforehand between the parties, who are each parties to the exchange of the message, about how that message is to be signed. And so there are three signs given between Tamar and Yehuda. One of them, a M.I.T, a staff, notably. And because these three things come together, it becomes somehow very hard to fake. A M.I.T, maybe you would say, I'm not sure that's the same M.I.T, or maybe it is, but maybe someone lost their M.I.T and someone else found it. But when you get all three of them, it starts to be, okay, how did you guess my password? You know, and clearly it gets harder as the password gets longer, and has more possibly independent elements that are hard to get right by accident. So I think that the Torah over and over again actually takes this notion of three separate elements and uses it as a talisman for the idea of something that ends up being so improbable that it pushes itself beyond the realm of chance occurrence and into the realm of this is part of a message of some kind. Now, where do we see that? Well, if we go down to the next source, one place that we see it explored, I would argue, is in the life of Yosef HaTzadik, because when he is kidnapped as a slave in Mitzrayim, the Ishmaelim who are taking him down to Mitzrayim are carrying three spices, tzri, lot, and nechot. And those spices turn out in source 6 to be exactly the same 3 spices that Yaakov Avinu independently decides, seemingly, to send down to Mitzrayim as a sort of gift basket to propitiate the Egyptian viceroy who has kidnapped his son Shimon. So we are seeing an aroma, an unmistakable combination of fragrances that Yosef would have smelled first in his life when this chapter was beginning, when he was being taken into Mitzrayim, and the same aroma would greet him when this gift is sent from Yaakov down to him. And it would be an unmistakable and instantaneous recognition that, in some sense, pushes too far beyond the ability to fake by accident. And of course, you could say, okay, well, 3 things still were in the realm of maybe 1 in 1,000 or whatever. Who knows? You know, this is not about 3 per se. It's about the idea of multiplying small probabilities together to get you something that's so small that you're not interested in calculating odds anymore. You're interested in what is the message, because it's clearly more a form of communication and less a form of random fluctuation. So I think the Torah is trying to show us in this example the idea of just a person who is living an otherwise naturalistically constrained life, but where the details of that life somehow occasionally poke up and show us that they're finely orchestrated in a way that almost no one would notice, or maybe only one person would notice. Yosef is the only one who might recognize this password, so to speak. But it would mean something to him. Perhaps it would mean that this chapter in his life is finally ending and great things were afoot. It might mean something else. And this is the hard part, is that interpretation of these things is devilishly difficult. And so we shouldn't assume that is straightforward just because you identified the anomaly. But nonetheless, we have, I think, some proof texts here for the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to speak to us through the anomaly, but not necessarily always in ways that we call obviously, quote unquote, unnatural or impossible, but perhaps simply subjectively improbable beyond our ability to imagine a possible explanation. And that's where we get to the guessing of the password kind of relationship. And this idea of multiplication with 3, you actually see across the tradition. I'll say as an aside, the notion of a chazaka, the idea of establishing an assumption with force in halacha, in Jewish law. There are instances where you observe something 3 times, such as with, for example, a Vesed Kavua and Masechet Midah, and then you say, okay, it can be assumed that things will happen. They'll keep happening this way because it happened 3 times, and now we kind of have found the pattern, and the pattern stands. But here we're seeing it in a narrative element that is showing us, in a sense, an example of how an individual could look at something in his own life and see improbability that's so improbable that it means something to him as an Oved Hashem who sees the handiwork of Borei Olam in the orchestration of the fine details of events, in this case, in his personal life. It might also be in the national life of Am Yisrael. So moving to the next source, I think that if we want to, we also could go back to the other 2 signs that are given to Moshe, in addition to the staff turning into the serpent, which are, on the one hand, tzarat, that he puts his hand to his bosom and it becomes mitzorat kashaleg, a snowy whiteness, which people mistranslate as leprosy, but which we should call tzarat because it's the Torah's understanding of a particular phenomenon in Jewish law, on the one hand, and then also the 3rd sign, which is pouring the water of the Nile on the dry ground, and it becomes dam bayabeshet, it becomes blood on the dry ground. I think, interestingly, those 3 signs, and I don't want to argue this at length right now because we have some time, you can look at them as 3 steps that also in their own way are trying to be another set of 3 that proves this point or makes this point to you, because you start at one end with the idea of the Nachash, which is the single, let's say, rare event. You step on the snake that you didn't see and something unexpected happens. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have dam, you have the idea of blood being the thing that suffuses the whole and connects every part of the whole to each other and makes it one living agent. So if the blood of the Nile becomes, sorry, if the water of the Nile becomes blood, it's standing for the idea of the whole of creation, the whole world, in a sense, becoming a living thing that is connected one part to the other. And I think that is the extreme alternate perspective, right? That you're not just looking at a single rare event, you're starting to appreciate this connectedness of all events to each other and the possibility of meaning to be discovered in all of them. And I think we don't have time to talk about today what this has to do with Ma'amad Har Sinai and Kol HaShofar and lots of other things that I think we should try to tease out. But the last thing I'll say before we can get to some discussion about this point is that I don't want at all to suggest from anything that I've been saying that somehow this is supposed to provide from the text of the Torah an easy procedure for taking a completely different interpretive relationship to the events of one's life or the events of history and seeing it all as everything's connected to everything else and now choosing forevermore to live like one with his hair on fire, constantly seeing messages in the whole of creation. There are a number of elements in the original sign given to Moshe, this Ot about the Nachash, that we have to be very careful about. One of which, as I mentioned, is the idea that Nachash evokes Nichush, which is pagan augury, that taking this kind of relationship to the world might actually be something, if you do it the wrong way, that you will just end up basically doing Avodah Zarah. And so one should have to think a lot more about what, so to speak, is the kasher way of relating to the world as though it is an interpretable set of events, such that you're not simply going around like a sorcerer trying to tell people's fortunes. Also, it must be noted that Moshe is instructed both to cast the staff on the ground, to turn it into a nachash, and also to pick it up again, so that it turns back into a M.I.T, which may be connected in a sense with this sort of idea of the nachash or nichush as temptation to sin, that this may be an ingredient to the attitude or the worldview of an Oved Hashem, but it is not, let's say, the default setting, because the default setting is not one where you say, well, I don't have any wine for Kiddush this Friday, and it must be because that has meaning, and the message is I'm not supposed to make Kiddush. That's completely the wrong way of reasoning about the world. You're supposed to say, well, one doesn't get wine without going out to the store and buying some, or perhaps making some out of grapes. And that's the normal way one gets some. And if you want to be an Oved Hashem and keep the Torah, you try to keep the mitzvot according to the assumption that the world is behaving naturally and expectedly. And you're not allowed to read signs from rare events and overturn the obligations of the Torah. But if you are well fastened in the language of Soloveitchik, one might say, by the injunctions of the Torah, it may be that what the example of Moshe is trying to show us, and what may therefore be the key to understanding a bit more about how the revelation of Sinai gets authenticated, it may be that you need at least two perspectives on how to interpret the events of your life in the world. You need, let's say, the physicalist, materialist perspective, the objective perspective, the notion of everything as an inanimate object that does what the force is pushing on it make it do. But maybe you also need to be open to interpretation of events in such a way that you could recognize that only a creator, or rather the creator of the world, who has unlimited power to influence any aspect of Maaseh Bereshit to reflect his will, that only he could have been the one who chose to, so to speak, sign his name somewhere for you to notice. And sometimes that might actually be the key to your successful tshuva, or the key to your conviction, making a choice as crazy as walking between two halves of a parted sea and expecting it not to drown you. So that's what I wanted to try to lay out today, and we can chat about things for a bit, and B'ezrat Hashem, we can try to finish this up next time.
Questions or comments, anybody?
If I may, I would like to weigh in for a moment on the point just made that a Torah Jew does not look at a given reality and assume or somehow deduce from it that if that's how it is, then that is the way it's supposed to be. I'll give you two examples that come to mind. Before I give those examples, I will just perhaps add another sentence, and that is that if one observes a certain reality in the world, it might be a physical reality, it might be a spiritual reality. It's possible that it is that way because it's supposed to be that way. A simple example would be that if we see that all human beings walk on their feet and not on their hands, it's not at all unreasonable to assume that that is because that is the way human beings are designed to ambulate, to move about. And it's not just an arbitrary decision, it's a very rational and unavoidable conclusion. So that is how it is supposed to be. So sometimes, yes, you see certain things and you can say to yourself, that is so because that is how it is supposed to be. That's normal, that's natural, that's the order of things, that's the way Hashem made it, created it, or intended it. But when are we in a position to think otherwise? We are in a position to think otherwise when the Torah informs us otherwise. In other words, if the Torah tells us that the way things should be, or an important concept in the Torah is X, Y, or Z, and you see that people are doing something different, not acting in accordance with that concept, then you have good reason to question whether that thing that you are observing or that reality that you note, whether it in fact should be so, or perhaps this is an aberration, or this is a possible outcome, but it's not the only correct outcome. In fact, according to the Torah, apparently a different outcome might be preferable, might be more correct. One example, totally unrelated to what we were discussing here today, but something which comes up in our discussions on many topics, is the statement that I have heard many times from people: if this is what Jews are doing, or all Jews are doing, or most Jews are doing, then apparently that is how it is supposed to be. More specifically, I have heard the claim, and I imagine many of you have heard this claim, that if Jewish people accepted the Shulchan Aruch, for example, as an halachic code, then that proves that it's supposed to be so. The reason to imagine that it might not be so is, first, by historical and rational analysis of how such a reality came into being, and B, based on the Torah concept that that the seal of Hashem's will and desired methodology in the world is to strive for truth and not just accept something because that's what someone else says or other people assume to be the case. Another example, again, totally unrelated, is a claim that I've heard on a number of occasions, that if the Muslims are currently in charge of Har HaBayit, or the Temple Mount, this indicates that this is what Hashem wants at this point in time. Now that might have been a reasonable conclusion, were it not for the fact that the Torah tells us explicitly that's not what Hashem has in mind. And one could just as easily reach the opposite conclusion, that that reality is so because we allow it to be so. In other words, because we are not doing what we are supposed to be doing. So therefore, others will do what they wish to do. In other words, there's no vacuum in the world. If you do not do something, or you don't lay claim to something, or you do not accept a certain responsibility, then other people will step in and do whatever it is that they wish to do. Both of those explanations are at least equally feasible, but when you add into the equation the fact that the Torah just explicitly states what should be on Har HaBayit and what should not be, then you know which of those possible interpretations is the correct one. I hope that the connection between the things I just mentioned and the theme of this shiur will be apparent. That when we see certain things in the world, a Torah Jew and Eved Hashem has to view that thing before reaching any conclusion through a Torah lens. There may be a number of hypothetical possibilities, but if the Torah leads you in a particular direction, you are supposed to be viewing that reality through that particular lens, and not assume other things which contradict the thrust of the Torah.
I completely agree with Bar-Hayim on this point, and I would add that this is something that I will try also to reference more in what I guess will be the second half of this discussion, which is that there's an additional element that has to do with iteration and the evolution of a state of affairs over time. Because none of this is actually static. It's not about a single binary decision of what is desirable for HaKadosh Baruch Hu or undesirable for him, judged once and for all, but actually it has to do with the actions of people on earth. It has to do with particularly the actions of Am Yisrael, meaning there was clearly a time at the moment of the destruction of either the first or second temple where it was not the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for those who wanted there to be a Judaic sacrificial cult on Har HaBayit. It was not possible for those people to succeed because HaKadosh Baruch Hu at that time had set his will against that. And the proof was in the pudding, that at that moment, presumably, no matter how much one tried, one was not going to succeed. And in Sefer Yirmiyahu, there are conflicts between Yirmiyahu, whom we view as the true Navi with the authentic message, who was saying at the time that we can't overcome the rule of Bavel, and others who were saying, no, of course we can. And the ones who had at the time what seemed like a more optimistic message turned out to be wrong, and the rebellion against Bavel may have speeded the destruction of the temple. But in the present moment, if one does nothing to assay how possible it is for Am Yisrael to lay claim to their duty and their heritage in such a context, we have no ability, so to speak, to get feedback. So empirically and a priori, you could say, we could find out that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would still answer, so to speak, not now, or it needs to wait in some way, or what have you. But no one who is completely unwilling to explore the possibility and so to speak, do experiments and get feedback, can claim they know that to be the case. So I think the iterative idea, the idea that, and in general, this it doesn't have to be a national question. It can be a question of individual struggling as well. You find out what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, not by doing sort of one test and encountering difficulty and saying he's opposed, or encountering ease and saying he's in favor. You walk the path and you go more than one round, and you learn from each of those experiences. And in the fullness of time, there's an opportunity to get an unmistakable message.
As Chazal say, Yorata umasata ta'amin. If a person strives repeatedly and succeeds, then that is the best proof that is what he was supposed to do. He had to strive, and he had to try repeatedly, not give up. The first sign of difficulty or failure, if we give up, we can never say this proves that Hashem was really not for this in the first place.
I was thinking of something else, which is that the default position when Hebrews say Breirat Mechdal should be to assume we have to do what we have to do in terms of the mitzvot. As far as Yirmiyahu, so that was the case of a prophet telling us, well, here's whatever the Breirat Mechdal might ordinarily be. Well, that's not going to be the default position right now. But right now, there is no Yirmiyahu telling us, no, the default position is not the correct position, and therefore we have to assume that the default position is the correct position.
Exactly so, precisely so. That is the purpose of nevuah, generally speaking, or at least one of the major functions of nevuah, to instruct us and direct us, either with regards to what needs to be done, with regards to something which is not explicitly discussed in the Torah. So in a given situation, we might not know exactly what we should do. The halakha doesn't provide us with a set of instructions as a particular situation, and it's legitimate to be unsure of how to proceed. That is exactly where we need a Navi to tell us the correct path now is A, and not anything else that you may have come up with. This is what Hashem wants you to do. If it was plain and obvious from the Torah, you wouldn't need the Navi to tell you this, because the Torah already discusses it. The Torah shebichtav, Torah she'ba'al peh, you would have at least a general idea of what to do. But if in a given situation, and there are such situations, both on in an individual's life and the nation, the life of the nation, you need a Navi to point you in the right direction. And conversely, as we just discussed now with regards to the Mikdash, normally there is a mitzvah of osoli Mikdash, to build a Mikdash, to have a Mikdash, to strive for that, to fulfill that mitzvah. But if a Navi at a particular point in time tells you right now, this thing is on hold, Hashem has decided it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future, that is a particular prophetic injunction which overrides the general default mode. In other words, following what the Torah tells us to do normally. That's the default position. In particular situations, the nevuah overrides that. That's why a Navi can tell Am Yisrael, right now you're allowed to transgress the Torah on a temporary basis in this particular matter, or you have to go and do something unusual that normally you wouldn't do. That's precisely what nevuah is for.
I would also add that the midah of Avraham Avinu that is widely celebrated as perhaps the most fundamentally Judaic characteristic is a willingness to have not only a dialogue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu about what should happen, but even an argument. And we see that in the context of Sdom and Amorah in Sefer Bereshit. And one must say, Kal v'chomer, how much more so is it the case that if one's attitude examining the Torah is, this seems to be what is commanded, then even if a certain amount of evidence from the events of the world could be piled up saying, perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu is pushing back against this, the job of the Avodah Hashem presumably is to, so to speak, try to convince HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to do so through action and through tefillah and through examination of one's kavanah. And it might eventually be the case that it becomes clear that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not saying yes at a particular moment, but one certainly can't reach that moment of relenting where perhaps the Navi steps in and explains the difficulty in the manner just described, if one doesn't try. And the default position should be to be trying to convince Hashem to help you to do that which you think he has commanded you to do.
I was thinking if there's any, I know that there's a few people here who are possibly a bit bashful, but very often have very intelligent things to say. So if one of them would like to say something, please do.
Could I ask a question somewhat unrelated to the Shiur, but definitely within your area of expertise?
Please, sure.
I've been very interested in evolutionary biology for a long time, and there is one problem recently that you could say within the last year that I've sort of been trying to figure out a little bit, and it has to do with epigenetics and methylation, and especially a problem within information theory, because it seems to me that in order for, at least the way I understand it, in order for, let's say, a cell to know that it needs to silence a certain gene, let's say, it has to have a certain knowledge, it has to have certain information outside of that system itself. So we have, your genome, bunch of DNA, and outside of that, you have the structure within the cell. That's where actual stuff's happening. It's translating and, oh wow, it's been a little while since I've taken biology. Translation and transliteration, not transliteration, something else. But regardless, methylation, it's silencing a gene. So my question, I guess, is, in order for it to have the information that it needs to silence this particular promoter or something, where's that coming from? Because it seems that it would require several times more information to know that it needs to silence all these potential genes within the genome then would be provided within the genome. So you'd have a certain amount of information, let's call it X, that's within the genome. Here are the genes, right? Protein coding sequences, enzymes, right? And then above that, you'd have an even larger amount of information to know, to silence these particular sequences and so on. And then it would almost create an infinite information problem. I don't know if that was at all a comprehensible question. I apologize. I wasn't ready to ask the question. I should have re-researched this a little bit, but
no trouble.
I understand what I was asking.
It's an interesting, let's say, space of questions. It probably could be a very long discussion. And I also shouldn't pretend that if we're talking about physical and biological sciences, that my area of expertise, as it should be defined, is centered on the different mechanisms of epigenetic regulation of gene expression. It's something I have to know more than nothing about, but I don't know the most about it that I know about some things, let's say. I think we have to go with maybe a short way of responding in the moment, and I'm happy to follow up afterwards, and we can try to flesh out a little bit more what you're driving at. I think in general, when talking about heritable traits, be they genetic or epigenetic, or let's say not the DNA, but different ways that living things can pass things, from one cell to another. There's a lot of new and interesting research about a diversity of different molecular mechanisms for this. And I think the short answer would be that usually when we think in terms of what we view to be the purpose of molecules in living cells, that is in a sense a model we've constructed for ourselves about all the basic thing that we think that they're doing. Like the basic story about what DNA is doing is the DNA is coding for the transcription of RNA and for the production of our proteins from that RNA. But there's a lot of other things going on there as well, because it's a physical object, it's a molecule, and as a result, the three-dimensional structure of the DNA may actually be something that is partly influenced by the DNA sequence, and that in turn may be related to its interaction with proteins that are going to be doing different things to regulate gene expression. That might include some of the epigenetic events you mentioned. So I think that the short answer to this is that if we pose questions in ways that sound like we have arrived at the conclusion that something that we see happening is impossible, then often that means that we've assumed some kind of straw man, a model of what's going on that could be made more complicated, and it could sort of make up the difference to explain to us what we're seeing. But I think I would need to talk to you a little bit more offline and at length to understand a little bit better what challenge you're specifically driving at. And that would be very interesting. So I'd be very happy to do that.
Sounds good. We should follow up then.
Sure.
Okay, so unless anybody else had any other questions, I'd like to thank Dr. England very, very much for this very stimulating evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Laila Tov to everybody. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.